So today we're looking at fiscal policy, how fiscal policy works, and uh, tools that we can use in fiscal policy, and how we can make our policy expand out to the actual economy, and what effects this will actually have on our system. So when we think about fiscal policy, again, the definition of this is we're looking at how the government can use spending and tax policy to influence the economy. And the two types of fiscal policy we'll see, a lot like monetary policy, just a little bit different. So two types we'll see, again, just like monetary policy, expansionary and contractionary. And expansionary is going to be that which increases the level of aggregate demand. So if we remember our aggregate demand curve, aggregate demand is equal to our consumption plus our investment plus our government expenditures plus our net exports, right? That is, it's our real GDP. So when we think about what each of these are composed of, if we have a policy, so if a policy basically increases spending in some way, it's going to be considered an expansionary policy. And there are two ways we can do this. The first is we can either increase our government spending, right? Because the two things that government control, again, are their own spending and tax policy. So we can either increase government spending or we can cut taxes, with the idea that if we cut taxes, um, people will use that tax revenue or use the saved tax money and go out and consume more goods. Firms will make more investments and so on. So we have these two things. And as we look at these, because we may say, well, yeah, but if we increase our if we cut taxes, then we have to cut government spending. If we raise government spending, we have to raise taxes. Technically, we probably should, but at this point, we're treating them as two separate actions. And if we think about kind of what's been going on over the past couple of years, a couple of years ago, we passed a tax cut, right? And that tax cut was there. That's the new tax code that we all go by, and so on. However, over the past month or so, we've passed a ton of government spending bills. A couple weeks ago, we had the stimulus package, which was a either 2.6 or 2.8 trillion dollar spending bill. So we increased government spending substantially, and that's kind of what we see going on, right? We either increase government spending or cut taxes. The other side that we can see with this is our contractionary. And this is going to be that which does just the opposite. It's going to work to decrease our aggregate demand. So to do this, we either going to cut government spending or we can increase taxes. The idea, again, that cutting government spending outright reduces their spending. But if we increase taxes, this means that's less money for you and I to go out and spend. So our aggregate demand goes down on that side. And if we think about one of the things that gets brought up a lot, especially in elections, is to talk about how, oh, well, I'm going to run a certain candidate's going to, get rid of the deficit, or we're going to get rid of the debt. And we say, why does that never actually happen? If we think about what the two parties are stereotypically associated with, and not saying that this is what they actually are, but what we typically tend to think of our two parties as, stereotypically, the Republican Party would be the party of tax cuts and limited government, right? Or small government. However, the Democratic Party normally is, and not that people want to pay more taxes, but they tend to be more open to tax increases. But they also are going to see an increase. They also want to go out and spend more. So between these two, if I say, yeah, well, I'm going to cut the deficit, or I'm going to, we're going to run a surplus when I get in office, or I'm going to attack the debt, whatever the case is. If I associate with a strict party line, it's not really going to work out that well. That's because if we think about this again on a personal level, if I say I'm going to, if I'm going to say I'm going to pay off all of my debt, right? If I can cut my personal spending, great. But if I also go out and say, yeah, I'm going to cut my spending, but I'm also not going to work anymore. Or I'm going to cut my hours, not take overtime or anything like that. But if I do both of those, it's hard to actually get ahead in terms of our loan payments. And same thing if I say, well, I'm going to work a bunch extra to pay off my debt. I'm going to sit and work a bunch extra, make a bunch of extra wages, increase my cash flow. However, if I do that, and then I go out and say, well, now I have more money, so I'm going to go out and go crazy a little bit. If I also increase my spending with my increase in income, again, I'm not going to come in and just wipe out my debt, right? Instead, ideally, what we could, if, and I'm saying this a little bit hesitantly, but if our goal was to pay off debt, we would want to both increase that. If our goal is to pay off debt as quickly as possible, we would want to increase taxes and cut government spending. Or if, um, excuse me, yeah. So yeah, if our sole focus was to pay off the debt, that'd be the action we want to take: increase our revenue and cut our spending. However, there may be a case that says, hey, maybe we don't necessarily want to go in and just wipe out the debt or anything like that. Maybe it's fine. And I would make the case that it's more important the debt itself is the debt as it relates to GDP, or are we able to make our interest payments? Are people fine, and so on. So we have these two. Um, and examples of each of these, again, if we think about an expansionary, the two examples that we may see, the first is either a cut in taxes, which is listed there, and the second type of expansionary that we may see is something like a stimulus package. So a couple weeks ago, they passed the piece of legislation that gave everybody $1,200 or $2,400, depending. Well, it gave every individual $1,200 that's under a certain income but pays taxes. Everybody in that boat got $1,200. So, or will be receiving, or should be receiving $1,200 at some point. For these people, we have the system where we increase government spending. We threw this money out. Also, another part of this bill was basically a forgivable grant for small businesses and even large businesses, but a forgivable grant for businesses and help with loans and stuff like that to keep paychecks flowing. And for these, again, we increase our spending as part of this stimulus package. The other contractionary are examples, as we can imagine. First would be a tax hike, which again is pretty much one of the definitions. But what we also may see with the contractionary is budget cuts in the government. So the government says, hey, we need to cut our spending by X number of dollars. This budget cut would be considered contractionary policy because they're pulling things back. Then the reason for each one is going to be just like we saw last week. I'm going to pass with fiscal policy. We still want to use our countercyclical policies. So if times are good, I want to pass contractionary policy. That is when everybody has money to spend, when economy is booming. That's a good time to pull things back, to watch out, keep an eye on inflation. However, if times are bad, we're in a recession or we're anticipating a recession, which right now I would say we are anticipating. We're not necessarily in one yet, but we're anticipating a recession. In this case, what we're seeing happen is we pass the stimulus package, and potentially there's talk and there's a piece of legislation that's been introduced to take that a step further. On April 16th, just for people who are watching in the future potentially, on April 16th, 2020, the piece of legislation coming through is a piece that says that we want to, meaning the federal government, wants to give $2,000 a month to individuals who make under $130,000 a year. And the plan is, as of right now, is for that to go on until employment reaches a normal spot. Again, that's as of today. Maybe tomorrow that's different, but that is something very live that came up yesterday. Um, and a lot of what we say, if we get into too many examples of what's going on now, that we could very quickly become outdated. So if you are watching this in the future, just be mindful. Maybe some of this stuff isn't what's actually going on, even if it's just the 17th. So that's what we're seeing going on right now. Fun stuff, fun times, and our examples of both expansionary and contractionary. Um, and before we had our, uh, well, I'll stick where we are and kind of let it keep going. So again, expansionary. The idea again is graphically what we'll see come up with this is we'll have our price level and our output. I'll have my short run aggregate supply look something like this, and then I'll have aggregate demand going down. If I pass expansionary policy, we're going to see our aggregate demand increase up to say 81. And if I pass contractionary policy, we'll see our aggregate demand decrease down to 82. And just like with monetary, expansionary, we'll anticipate we'll raise our real GDP and it will raise our price level. In contractionary, we'll do just the opposite. And our price level will be like that. And a little bit later on, we'll talk about some issues that come up. So what the policy that's being coming through right now, the stimulus package, maybe a second round of stimulus packages, whatever comes up, all of these are going to be considered discretionary fiscal policy. This is stuff that, and we'll introduce this again in a second, but these are things that it's a one-time deal. You had to have a piece of legislation that goes through, and so on. So when we don't have our discretionary, oops, that's the phrase I was coming up to first. I thought these were flipped, my bad. So we have discretionary fiscal policy, and this is that which, again, we outright pass a law that changes the tax or spending levels. So the example they have is the 2019 stimulus package. We also have, now we have the 2020 stimulus package. And then we also have the 2017 tax cuts or 2018, whichever year it passed, the tax cuts that came through. So again, it's something where the government says, hey, we're going to pass this new law, or we're going to change tax code or change our spending levels. So they do that. And again, this is kind of a one-time thing. The big deal of, well, it can be continuous, but the big deal with this is we have to pass a law to make that change. The other type of policy that we can have or way to change spending is going to be through what's called an automatic stabilizer. And for this, what we're going to see is that we're going to have programs or tools that more or less is an automatic stabilizer. So it's going to automatically change based off of the state of the economy. So yeah, so how we have it defined is that it slows down the rate of decrease when the economy slows down, and it restrains aggregate demand when things speed up. And for this, we don't have to pass pieces of legislation. So for this, the two big areas that we're going to see this is our unemployment insurance and food stamps. So when times are, so in a recession, or in this case, a shock to the economy, we'll see that our unemployment claims are increasing, and they are increasing quickly. And if you see, they'll say, "Oh, well, today, so many." I think somewhere around 220,000 people in Iowa have registered for unemployment. So, just something where again, we're seeing these unemployment claims increase. People are out of work right now. That income may be slowed down, so they're filing for unemployment and so on. And again, this is something where uh, and ignore the $600 a week extra for now. But when we think about unemployment claims, one of the things we're seeing is again, if I'm out of work or something goes wrong, I can go in, file for unemployment, and I get to draw. I get to draw, get at least some of my income back. So when we have this again, we have unemployment. However, when times get better, so when the economy gets back into normal shape, we'll see these unemployment claims uh, will start to fall. That is, I can't file for unemployment if I'm working, and if everybody's working, a relatively small amount of people are be filing for unemployment. So something like unemployment, again, when times are bad, more people file for it, more spending comes down. When times are good, less people file for it, so there's less spending coming out of the government. And with this, as we can probably imagine, it's not well, not as we can imagine as it is. If I go in tomorrow and I file for unemployment, um, what's going to happen is there's not going to be a bill that comes through the Iowa legislature that says Kevin Cook gets unemployment, or there's not going to be a bill that goes through Congress that says I, as an individual, get that. Instead, there will be a process that says, well, do you meet this, and this criteria? If you do, you get unemployment. If you don't, you don't. So again, things that are automatic, they don't require the legislature to come in and increase or decrease these spending tools. So when we're thinking about our policy, right, whether it's discretion, well, largely when we're thinking about our policy in general, one of the issues that we have when we talk about our budget is we have just that going on in terms of we have these shocks that come in. So right now, right, nobody's working, or let me rephrase this. A lot of people are not working right now. Um, so right now, our unemployment spending is going to be very high because a lot of people are doing that and so on. Um, Given that, though, when we're thinking about our policy, and especially if I'm thinking more on a long-term basis, sometimes I want to have a way to say, well, yeah, things might be a little weird right now, but what would things be like if we were in full employment, or what would things be like if we were in regular times? So in that case, we have what's called the standardized employment budget. So with this, what we're looking at is we're saying, all right, yes, we have this. So we passed this 2.6 or $2.8 trillion spending bill. Um, right, and that's part of our budget for this year. But if times were normal, we would not have spent that. Um, so when we think about this, what we're looking at is a budget where what would things be like if we were producing close to or at our potential GDP? That is, again, firms are making normal profits, people are finding jobs, and so on. And what our standardized employment budget is going to look like is if we think about this on a personal level, this is just going to be like your regular budget. Right? That is, I have my income, my regular income, and my regular expenses. Okay. And if you think about how you probably want to do your personal budget, odds are you're not going to budget. Over the next between you supposedly we're supposed to get it this week, but sometime this week or next week, um, people are supposed to be getting the stimulus package, right? So this $1,200 check from the government or direct deposit, but you get the point. So we have this. If when I think about my personal budget, you're probably not gonna throw this one-time $1,200 payment into your regular budget. And granted, it may go into your regular bank account, but it's not gonna go into your regular budget or your monthly deal because next month you may not see this, right? Or last month you didn't have it, next month you may not have this. So we have changes that come up and we have shocks that come in. So in this case, a in the case of our economy right now, the shock to the economy is coronavirus shutting everything down. If we think about our personal budget right now, and even though this may sound weird, the stimulus check that you may be receiving in the next either this week or next week, sometime soon, this stimulus check is going to be a shock to your budget because it's something that isn't the month before, it's not the month after, it's this one time deal, and so on. So when you refer to this regular income, this is again my regular income. What do I make for my full time job? Then my regular expenses, again, I have bills that are consistent, and we have things we do that are fairly consistent, right? Maybe within those, maybe it's well, in the winter I do winter activities, in the summer I do summer activities, but we have some things that stay relatively the same, right? That is my like our rent bill, your insurance bill, stuff like that. Doesn't really change much. However, if I have a something goes wrong with my car right now and I have to put say $1,000 into it, I'm not going to take that $1,000 and just throw it into my budget and say, well, now I have to spend $1,000 every month on my car, right? Instead, it's a one-time deal. It needs a fix, and so on. So this is what, on a personal note, take that back to standardized employment budget. What do things look like on a regular day when times are, normal, and so on? And that's what again this is looking at. And this is a nice tool to look at for policy, just because it'll help us get a better long-term idea of where we're going and what certain policy will do. So whereas right now, yes, if we want to pass more stimulus packages, we can. But again, these stimulus packages are going to be temporary deals. Whereas if we think about something like a tax cut, we're going to want to look more at this standardized budget because it's something where, right, we put in this tax cut. Yes, there may be a shock that comes up, but we want to look at how it's going to affect our budget when times are normal. So, standardized employment, again, more of a long term type way of looking at our budget, just because, again, we're not going to have coronavirus come through every year. We're not going to have a recession every year, and so on. Cool. And what we see on this chart kind of puts them together. And you kind of see that your standardized deficit, for the most part, is it largely mirrors, or your deficit or surplus, that is your standardized budget, it largely mirrors the actual, but it's going to be, and this may be hard to see, and I might be making it worse, but oh well. So you're gonna see that it does mirror the actual budget, but it's going to be toned down a little bit, just because again, so in 2000, so right here in 2009, this budget was assuming, and granted, it's still impacted, but it takes out some of the things that are temporary payments. So that's kind of how these can look. So we have our fiscal policy. We talked about the advantages of it, but what are some issues? What kind of problems face fiscal policy? And again, we're looking more at discretionary because our automatic stabilizers, they're there. Excuse me, in our policy, again, our long-term policy, it's policy. Hopefully we're making good long-term policy. But we do see some issues that come up when we pass a stimulus package or when something like this comes up. We do have these issues, and we have a few that we'll introduce in the next couple minutes. And then we'll get into a little talk about a balanced budget. So the federal government is part of the monetary system, right? They don't make monetary policy, but the federal government can take loans, they can do all that kind of stuff. So our fiscal and our monetary policy, we're going to see some connection between them, right? That is, if we go out and we spend $2.6 trillion, we have to find some way to come up with the money. That money comes from somewhere. So uh, we're going to see these two are interconnected. And one of the issues that can come up with fiscal policy is this first thing's called crowding out. So when the government borrows, the government is doing just that. They are borrowing money. So when the government decides to go out and borrow money, that's less money. That is less money that's available to be loaned out to the private market. So when the government borrows money or if they spend, we're going to, in general, tend to see higher interest rates, and this could reduce investment and household consumption. So what this is going to look like. If we look at our money market, we have an interest rate and we have a quantity of loanable funds. Then we say we have a supply that looks something like that. Um, so what we're going to see happen, and then we have an initial demand curve that goes down something like this. Now, and this demand, we'll think of this more as our private demand. So kind of two things can happen. The first, if we have an increase, we can think of the government as being a player, in which case, if they introduce a new spending bill or they borrow more, we're going to see that this demand curve will increase, which again will increase interest rates, but that'll leave less for the rest of us. Now, if we want to think of this in terms of the private market, what we're going to see happen with the government is when the government takes out their loan, I personally like to think of this as the private, just because it's a little, I think it's a little more straightforward. But when the government takes out their new loan, its new spending, we're going to see the supply of loanable funds fall because the government kind of took some off the top before anybody else could. Now, when this happens, we see interest rates will rise. Right, so our interest rate goes up from RO to R1, and then the quantity of loanable funds in the private market will fall. Okay. So whereas yes, I may be receiving a stimulus check, but now the bank doesn't have as much money to make a loan. So it might be easier. So something that could come up, and just a hypothetical, potentially if you're in the housing market, it might be easier over the next couple months to come up with our down payment for a house. Because if you're married, there's potential that you're getting an extra $4,000 a month for the next few months, and if you still have a job, that'll just kind of stack up. At least that's the way it seems to be. So in this case, again, I have these higher interest rates, so it might be easier to come up with a down payment because I have this increase in money that in terms of stimulus packages. But now it might be harder for me to go out and get a loan or get a loan at a good interest rate because there's less money to be loaned out to the public. So that's a part of the fiscal policy and this first issue of crowding out. We do have some tools in place to prevent this. So part of our stimulus package does go to the banks, so the banks will have money to loan out and keep things going. But again, it's one potential side effect of it. The other side that we may see is there are time lags. So when we think about our policies, it takes time for fiscal policy to get to go into place. So one of the things that we said was with what's going on right now, and right now is like a really nice example for this. The first thing that we had, and if we just think about what happened with the original stimulus package, the one that gave $1,200 to almost everybody, or everybody who makes under what 75,000, or the one who made it, the stimulus package check that went through fairly recently. Before this came in, there were kind of three things that had to happen in order to get this check out to people. The first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that there is a recession, or we have to recognize that we're anticipating a recession. So if we think about the path of the virus right now, um, the first and I'm not going to be too nitpicky on when exactly the date was, but it seems like in like mid to late January, um, the first talks of it being kind of serious, of there being potential for something serious to come through, uh, started. We let's see. We started our on January 31st. We started to do travel restrictions to China as a result of the virus. So, right, so just some things that we had those initial signs, but at that time, it wasn't really among the public. It wasn't really well thought of, and there were some signs that maybe something might come up, but we were kind of relaxed about it. Not at least from my perspective, we weren't really too freaking out about it at that point. But between then and the middle of March and the week of our spring break, around March 15th or so, was kind of the um, it seemed like that was when the spark was lit. We had to realize, well, there's a virus, and this virus is going to have an effect on our economy, right? So we had to realize that that was going to happen, or maybe we have to recognize and realize that a recession has occurred. So in this case, our recognition lag maybe went from January 31st to say March 15th. Right. And as I say this, I do understand hindsight is 2020, right? We can say, "Oh yeah, well we should have done something in November." Right? And people say, "Oh, we should have done something then." But right, understand as we hear stuff, hindsight's 2020. You can say, "Oh yeah, well we knew this was going to happen," or something like that. Uh maybe not, but there are uh you know, you it's a virus. Sometimes they can go out, sometimes they have their little thing and they go away. Right? And as we've gone through the whole thing with the current virus, we've had a lot of talk of, well, is it a real virus? Isn't anything? For a while, we were saying, well, it's just like a flu, just kind of a not so great flu. Then it's like, well, no, it's not a flu, right? So we've had all these changes as we've gone through, and as we've learned more about how it actually works, we've received more updates and all that stuff. But it seems like from this little window, March 15th is when we actually realized, oh, things are about to hit the fan a little bit, and things are about to kind of not go so great. So we have to realize that so two things. One, we have to recognize that we're in a recession, or that we're about to be in a recession, or have a recession like period. But then we have to agree that we're in a recession, right? So we can come in and say, and whereas right now we may have this first quarter of uh, decline, but if we remember the definition of a recession, it's two consecutive quarters. Let me just make sure I get this right. I just want to make sure I'm getting my fine points right. Yeah. So we're looking for two consecutive quarters of economic decline. So if there's something happens where, quarter two of 2020 has declined, but then quarter three picks back up, technically we never went into a recession. So, we can have this disagreement on, well, are we in one? Are we? And, there is that definition, but even though we may technically not enter a recession, doesn't necessarily mean that, times aren't great right now. So we have that recognition lag. But then after the recognition lag, Our policy needs to get through Congress, right? So it takes time. Our bill has to get passed. It has to go from the House to the Senate to the president. And like right now, we have a split House and Senate. That is, the House is Democrat, Senate's Republican. So, in order for a piece of legislation to get through, it has to be something that will go through both parties, right? And what we saw happen was initially, I think, and if I'm not 100% correct on all my fine points, uh, forgive me, but basic understanding of how the bills went through, and I haven't personally read them because they're kind of long reads and I have better things to do. But initially, you had a bill that was fairly much saying, "Hey, we started out with like a $2 trillion bill, right? We said we want this to go towards businesses and individuals, right? We started out with that, and so on. But then, so that bill went through Senate or it started to go through Senate, and then it had to get approved by basically it would have made it through Senate, but it wouldn't have made it through the House. So they did some negotiating and said, well, what can we do? Then the House came up with this. It was like a $3.4 trillion bill where they had a bunch of stuff in it and so on. And then that bill got brought into the Senate pretty much. And then it got negotiated down to that 2.6 or $2.8 trillion bill. So we went through and kind of hashed it out and figured out, well, what's something that works for, in this case, both houses or both parties. But stimulus bill passage. But in this case, this bill was passed on March 27th. At least that's the day the news article came in. So between around March 16th to March 27th, we had this legislative lag. So then the implementation lag would have been from after it was passed, from March 28th to about today. Right. That is, if we think about let's get that off before I get an ad running. So we have these three types of lag. Again, recognition. We have to realize that a recession is going on. We have to realize that something is going on. Legislative, our policy has to get through Congress, so it has to go through House, Senate, then get passed, then get signed on by the president. And then our implementation, it takes time for funds to be dispersed and to figure out how people are going to get them. And for this implementation for this one, I would actually say this is more ongoing. So it started, I believe the first people were saying they got theirs around April 10th. So this one started around April 10th, but then it kind of keeps going, right? And that's because not everybody has their check yet. If you don't have direct deposit, there's going to be a delay on it. If some people don't have their direct deposit yet, and so on. So it's taking time for these funds to actually get to the people they're supposed to go to. And that's what we're seeing again with our three things: recognition, legislative, and implementation lag. Now, the downside of this, right? So we have this new bill coming through, right? And it started the first time I heard about it. So on the left, I have phase one. Oops. We have phase one corona. So on the right, I'm going to show kind of what our phase two is. So currently, the recognition is still kind of there because we realize, hey, this is still going on. Maybe we don't realize how long it's going to go on yet, right? Some people are talking about opening up and they're talking about some parts of the country opening up in May, while others are saying, well, I know that Alaska is going to be hit. Yesterday, Princess Cruise Lines and Holland America announced that they were basically suspending most of what they have going on in Alaska for their cruises. So, it's kind of going to mess with the Alaskan economy some. So for them, we're still learning and realizing what all is going to happen as a result of this. But with the second one, we have this legislative part. right? And we had a bill that got proposed yesterday. Yep. So April 15th, and that's going to go on until right until they get this bill going on. Maybe it gets passed. Maybe we don't do anything. Right at this point, we don't know. So phase one, we're in this process of it getting of our funds getting dispersed. In phase two, we're up here in this legislative lag portion. Now the concern is we're in legislative lag for policy right now, right? And it's going to go through. And suppose that this new thing comes in, and right, we pass $2,000 a person for everybody 16 and over that makes under $130,000 a year, something like that. In this case, we'll have April 15th. Suppose that this gets passed on around May 1st or so. And I'll put this in blue just to represent a suppose. Right, so we have this part is solid. But then suppose that this gets passed around May 1st. And then they said that if this second were to come through, it would be starting around June that we actually start seeing stuff. So in this case, we have May 2nd. Then it would potentially be June, where again we get into this part where things start coming out. There's a chance, and I'm not don't take this as me being me trying to predict what's going to happen with the virus or anything like that, but there is a chance that come June things are relatively calmed down, right? There's a chance that people are going back to work, that things are better by then. So if people are going back to work, if everything's going back by then, we're getting these stimulus packages when the economy is already picking itself back up. So the issue that can come up here is something like this. So again, we have our price level and our output. We have our short run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand. So suppose that today, our aggregate demand is somewhere down here. And this would be on 4/16. And as we go through time, suppose that starting today things start to get better. We passed our peak, and I'm not saying that we have. I'm just saying suppose that for the sake of this example, things start getting better today, and by the time we get to say a month from now, we're up to here. So aggregate demand for May 15th. If this package for June comes in after everything's already fixed, we're going to see our aggregate demand come up to something like this. So 80, say 6.1, and this will be as a result of second stimulus package. So if things were to pick up and then we pass the stimulus package, we could potentially run into this huge problem of inflation. Right, so we have P2, P1, and it's a relatively large amount of inflation with a relatively small amount of economic growth. So with our lags, the couple things that can come up is, or the issue that we might see with them is that by the time everything works out, or by the time our funds get to where they're supposed to be, things might be back to normal, or things may be normal. And if things are normal, this policy could potentially make a new situation. And again, as I'm doing this, I'm throwing in a lot of ifs, so I'm not giving commentary on the policy. I'm just saying, again, if things got better too quickly and quote unquote too quickly, meaning in terms of for our policy to have an impact. So in this case, we have this new situation, which could, in this case, lead to a concern of inflation. Right. So we start getting this extra $2,000 a month, but then if everybody's getting that, we'll see this increase in prices. Again, if we're down here, not really a big deal, right? We just have we have a little bit of an increase, and price levels will go up a little bit, but we have this increase in output that's higher. So if we're in the toilet and we have inflation, not really a big deal because again, more growth than inflation. However, if we're up here and we have the same growth, we're going to see a lot of inflation and potentially uh, prices go up fairly substantially. So when our prices go up, it's not really ideal. And yes, I might be making an extra $2,000 a month, but what good is that 2,000 a month if now everything across the board is more expensive? And if it's substantially more expensive, it could potentially taper out that effect from our growth or from our piece of legislation. So our lags, they kind of have that little issue to them, and so on. So last little bit for this video is going to be, at least for the recording, oops. Okay, so last little bit for this is going to look at a balanced budget. Right, and we hear this talk about, oh, we need a balanced budget and so on. What are some advantages and disadvantages of this? So first of all, we'll look at is, again, we're looking at why would we be for it and why would we be against it? And I'm just going to come off to the side, that way it can make it kind of a little more, maybe a little more straightforward in our organization. So we're talking about a balanced budget. And the big reason for it, at least to me, the reason for it is fairly straightforward. It's largely about government spending accountability. Right. And the idea there, again, is to keep our spending needs to stay in check. Right. So what I'm saying here is, again, if we come in and we're going, if we're coming in and we're going we're running $5 trillion deficit after a $5 trillion deficit, and that just keeps going on and on and on, right? That's kind of an issue, right? Because just like in the real world, or not the real world, just like on a personal level, if I come in and if you think that a credit card is money that's available for you to use, you may have this issue as well. But if I come in and I say, well, I'm gonna I buy a new car this month, right? So then there's $20,000 of debt. Next month I buy something else that gets me more in debt. And if every month I get more and more and more in debt, eventually I'm going to run into an issue. So when we think about our government spending accountability, we say, hey, we need to keep our spending at a reasonable level so that we don't run into issues with our debt. And that's the first part of it. And to me, that's really the big reason for it. And again, it's one of those reasons, it's a big reason, and it's at least from my perspective, it's a fairly straightforward reason. And again, remember that a balanced budget is when our tax revenue is equal to our government spending. However, there is a case against it, right? And the case against it is a little more, I don't think nuance is the right word, but there's a couple more details to look into. So our side against it's going to say yes, right? We do need to keep our spending in check, right? We can't just go in and make billion. We can't just come in and come into debt, more debt, and more debt. Just like I as an individual, I can't just say, well, I'm going to buy one house this month, a new house next month, and so on, right? I can only have so much debt based off my income and so on. Well, I can have as much debt as I want, but to be smart and reasonable, you should only have so much debt compared to your income. So when we think about against it, we run into two situations though. We're going to make the case that a balanced budget is unflexible. So what's this mean? This means that kind of two things. So in a recession, or so say we start with in a boom, or we'll start in a recession. Why not? So if we are in a recession, right, we're probably going to expect our spending, expect our, we'll expect high spending, but relatively low revenue, right? So what this means, again, during a recession, I'm going to spend more money, or I may spend the same amount, but I as the government may spend the same amount, but I'm not necessarily going to have as much revenue coming in because if people aren't working, then they're not paying income taxes and so on. So we have high spending and low revenue. The other way we can think of this is we'll expect a relatively higher deficit or lower surpluses. Right? So if I'm the government, when people aren't working, I don't collect as much taxes, I don't have as much revenue coming in, or maybe I need to spend more for this discretionary policy. And on a personal note, when we think about a recession, we may think of this as what happens if I lose my job. For me as an individual, what happens if I lose my job, or if something happens where I have to take a pay cut? Or on the other case, what happens when something goes wrong? Uh, say something happens to my car, I need to go out and buy a new car, or that one time kind of thing comes up. If I had to have a balanced budget, it would be hard to make this happen because, uh, right, if I don't keep how do I put it? If something were to go wrong, something big were to happen, I would like to be able to take out a loan, right? I'd like to be able to say, well, I need a new car, so I'm going to go get it financed, and that way I don't have to come up with $20,000, within a week, right? Instead, I just go out, buy a new one, finance it, and then I can pay it off over time. So when times are bad, or when some kind of shock happens to the negative, potentially I have a month or I have a year even, where I spend more than I make. However, on the other side, if we're in a boom, we may expect, uh, I'm going to say we're going to expect higher revenue. And I'm not going to say we're going to expect lower spending because you kind of can imagine uh, government doesn't really take spending easy much. But when we're in a boom, we're going to often see we'll have a higher surplus or we'll have a lower deficit. So when times are very good, right? So if I'm coming in, I have my full paycheck, I'm able to work overtime, I, maybe have a side gig that's, doing well and so on. So in this case, I have all this income coming in, and if nothing goes on with my car or everything's working fine around the house, I'm going to have potentially some money left over at the end of the month. Now, again, if I have to keep a perfectly balanced budget, this may be hard to do because I need that flexibility to be able to save for the future. So, the big downside of the balanced budget is it doesn't allow for uh, these types of behaviors. Again, when times are bad, if something comes up, I need to be able to get a loan to, to make things work. Uh, just like on a personal level. Whereas, yes, I as an individual do have to keep my cash flows in check. I do have to make sure that I don't go out and go too crazy with it. But at the same time, if something were to come up, I am able to. I would be allowed to, spend a little extra this month and then pay it off over the next few months. Um, and same thing, if times are very good, maybe I don't have to spend as much this month, so I can put money aside uh, I can maybe put money aside for tomorrow, or I can pay off my past debts. Um, and in the long term, so we have the short run, right? We have benefits from the fluctuations, and uh, being able to not run a balanced budget allows us to you know, fluctuate things. However, in the long run, what we're going to see is that there's potential that your investments, whether that be in human or physical capital, could actually boost our long-term productivity. So we'll say with this is if the government comes in and they invest in a new infrastructure, a new highway, or whatever the case may be, this new this piece of spending could actually end up increasing productivity more than the actual spending itself. So maybe I say, all right, we're going to invest in, say, new roads, or we're going to invest in education, or whatever the case is. We make this investment, but then the return on it will hopefully be better than the investment that we put in. So, and to make these investments, we might have to take out a loan against tomorrow. So again, if we have a balanced budget in the long run, we wouldn't be able to do this. Um, but again, when we think about it, there's probably so we have our case for it and against it. There's probably some sort of middle ground where we say maybe we don't have to have a strict balanced budget, but maybe we can find some way to keep our spending accountable, right? Just like myself, if I go out and I try to buy a $10 million home, I'm gonna get told no because I don't have the money to be able to pay it off. Similarly, maybe we want to have some sort of check on our national debt so that we're not sitting and going too crazy with it. And I don't mean that to be any type of insinuation on what we have going on right now. But we want to keep things in check so that again things aren't going so things aren't going crazy, but at the same time we want that flexibility so that when there is an event that happens or when a shock does happen, we're able to pay for it, we're able to ease that blow with the recession and so on. So this is what I have for our chapter on fiscal policy. Next week, or yeah, next week, what we'll be getting into is our we'll be getting into international economics.